Good evening to those of you who are in the US, and good morning to those who are in China. Welcome to our webinar hosted by the Committee of 100. My name is Eric Zheng. I'm a member of the Committee of 100. It is my pleasure to moderate today's discussion on the changing perceptions of Americans and Chinese towards one another and the implications of such changes. According to Brunswick's latest research, in recent years, there's been a sharp downturn in Americans' opinion of China and Chinese opinion of the US. It is rather obvious that opinion on each side of the Pacific is at a historic low. The latest findings by Brunswick Group shed important light on the current US-China bilateral relations and the challenges lie ahead. We are very pleased to have as our presenter today, Peter Zisk, Director of Brunswick Group, Beijing. Brunswick is an advisory firm specializing in helping clients navigate the interconnected financial, political, and social worlds to build trusted relationships with their stakeholders. Today, Peter will share with us some of the key findings in Brunswick's latest research on the perceptions of Americans and Chinese towards each other. We'll begin today's program with a presentation by Peter, followed by Q&A. When you submit questions, please use the Q&A button. Now, without further ado, let me turn it to Peter Zisk for his presentation. Peter.
Thank you very much, Eric, and thank you, C100, for having me here today. And thank you, everyone, for joining. This is obviously a very important topic right now, and I'm happy to share some of the research findings that Brunswick has been collecting now for over the past year, with our most recent research completed at the end of June. So I want to start off by talking a little bit about where we are at this very moment. And Eric already set this up a little bit. You know, what we've seen happen over the past year or so has been a really sharp downturn in American opinion of China and Chinese opinion of the US. If we look at our most recent polling from the end of June of this year and compare that to last year, especially last fall, we see really significant drops in opinion in either country. Now only about a quarter of Americans say they have a favorable view of China, and only roughly a quarter of Chinese say the same about the US side. Now, we can put this into a longer historic context by comparing this data to some other tracking studies that have been running for a longer amount of time. In the US, the Gallup poll has been tracking American favorability towards China since 1979. And actually, Committee of 100 has been tracking Chinese opinion of the US since actually before 2007. And what we see when we bring this into a bigger historic context is that we've never been to a point where American opinion of China and Chinese opinion of the US has been as negative as it is at this current moment. And it also is important to keep in mind that this polling was done at the end of June. And that was before the bilateral relationship became even more strained. This was before the consulates in Houston and Chengdu were closed. It was before the Trump administration really stepped up its actions against Chinese companies in the US, most notably TikTok and WeChat. It was really before we saw a much more tense environment between the US and China. So if we ask this question again today, which we will be doing shortly, we'll be doing another wave of this research right after the US election. I expect what we've seen is opinion deteriorate even further. Just one methodological note before I go on further. This survey is coming from a nationally representative sample of Americans and Chinese. Survey 1,000 people every wave. It's nationally representative to make sure that this really represents what either country looks like overall. And it's a online survey. So what's really causing this downturn in attitudes on either side of the Pacific? We know that COVID-19 is the huge factor this year. You know, when we were doing this research throughout the trade war last year, one of the things that surprised us was how remarkably stable people's opinions were overall. But that's clearly changed this year with COVID-19 being that big factor influencing more negativity. I think this question signals that very clearly. We asked an open-ended question around if your opinion of China, if you're in the US, has changed, and if you're in China, if your opinion of the US has changed, tell us why. So people can write anything they want. We don't give them any options. And on the US side, what we see is really, really telling. 42% of Americans say that their views have become more negative towards China because they're blaming China for the pandemic. And that's a much larger share than anything else that Americans are saying around why their views of China are changing. And I can tell you in any polling I've done, not just sort of US-China polling, not just corporate polling, but even when I look at presidential election polling, I've never seen one open-ended question where an idea cut through as strongly as right now COVID-19 is cutting through in the American sentiment towards China. So this really tells you how strong that linkage is on the American side and how big of a problem that is in terms of creating a much more negative atmosphere when Americans look towards China. Now, on the Chinese side, their negativity towards the US is really driven by three factors, and you see the pandemic cutting across those. So the first of those is the irresponsible actions of the US government and president. This is how the Chinese respondents were phrasing this. And actually, what they were talking about here was less about the domestic situation going on in the US and more about the stepping up of anti-China actions and anti-China sentiment and rhetoric coming out of the US government. So again, if we fast forward from the end of June to now, I expect that share of Chinese consumers citing that as the #1 driver of their negativity towards the US has grown. The #2 factor on the Chinese side is the blame game that the US and especially US politicians are playing over COVID. They see that attempt to shift blame and see that in a very negative way. And then 3 is poor response to the pandemic in the US. The Chinese side is looking at the American side and wondering why it is seemingly so difficult to get the pandemic under control, where China was able to do so. So it's a bit more of a complicated picture and where the negativity on the Chinese side is coming from, but the COVID-19 pandemic is clearly a big factor in both countries. Now, being an election year, one of the very important questions we had is the sentiment shared by Americans of different political parties, or is this more something that's more aligned by the Republican voters and Trump's base? That's where a lot of this blame China rhetoric has been coming through more sharply. What we learned when we ask about whether different organizations should be blamed or praised due to their response to the pandemic, we see that almost 3 in 4 Americans overall say they blame China for its handling of the pandemic. And importantly, that cuts across Americans of both political parties. I mean, one of the things that I find really interesting in this data is that if you look at the Democrat voters, they're blaming China just as much as they're blaming the federal government for what they're seeing as poor handling of the pandemic. So this really is a bipartisan issue, and I think this extends beyond handling of the pandemic. When we look at favorability towards China, what we see is Republicans and Democrats have similarly negative views towards China overall. Now, It's also important to think about this beyond the voter base and look at how Washington, D.C. has been looking at China and legislating China over the past few years. If we start by looking at Congress, what we've seen during this current Congress is more bills being put forward than any other Congress in US history. There's been, at this point now, more than 300 bills and resolutions related to China during this 116th Congress. That's twice as many, more than twice as many as any other Congress. And the Republican Congress people are putting forward slightly more bills, but Democrats are not far behind. And what that signals is that really being tough on China and adopting a more confrontational stance towards China is a truly bipartisan issue. There's bipartisan alignment on within DC of seeing China as a threat that needs to be managed. And that signals that this is going to be a long-term challenge that anyone engaged in US-China needs to be planning for. If we look at the presidential election right now, it seems like being tough on China is the only issue that Vice President Biden and President Trump actually see eye to eye on. If you look at how they talk about China, they're both criticizing the other as not being tough enough on China and say that they would be the tougher one. And this creates some more elements of challenge. So, one question we get a lot is, is the election somehow going to fix this tense situation between the U.S. and China? I don't think it will. If you look at how locked in Congress is in a more confrontational position against China, if you look at the positions of the presidential candidates, I think we've entered a new era where this is going to be a long-term period of tension between the two countries. There might be different ways of engaging with China based on who sits in the White House in January, but the overall position isn't going to change very much. Now, among the general public in both countries, we see some similar attitudes coming through, especially a stepping away from a belief that cooperation is in the best interest of both of these powers. So one of the silver linings in this data and in public perception right now is that still a majority of Americans and majority of Chinese still do say that they believe that collaboration between the US and China is in the best interest of both countries. And I believe that this comes from just a recognition of how important that bilateral relationship is. Now, one of the challenges here is where that trend's headed, which is every single time we have asked this question over the past year, fewer Americans and fewer Chinese have said, yes, I believe that collaboration is in our mutual interest. So, one bright spot there, and that people have not given up hope in the power of collaboration, but the trend is not headed in a good direction at all. Another place where we see a challenging trend is when we cut the favorability towards the other country by age. So historically, what we've seen in US-China polling is a consistent trend where younger generations in China and in the US have been more favorable and more open to exchange with the other country than older generations. And it starts to stair step down as you get to older generations. Now, when we first did this polling in the US and China, that trend was generally true. In the US, that trend is still true, with actually the declines in opinion across age groups going down by roughly the same amount, with one exception, this 40 to 49 age group, which seems to be a outlier there. Now, in China, we see a different trend taking place when we ask them about the US. What we actually see is that the older generations, 50 plus, their views towards the US didn't change a lot. But when you get down to the younger age groups, especially this 18 to 29 demographic, their views actually became more negative than the other groups. So they had a 25-point drop. Their favorability towards the US actually more than halved. And now they're roughly on par with the 30 to 39 and 40 to 49 age group. So, that bigger drop, faster drop in changing views among that younger demographic is a really challenging one. I was actually at I've been presenting this data at some of the embassies, and this has been one point that has been creating a lot of conversation when we've taken this into different governments in China, including the US and UK embassies. There's a lot of conversation about the challenges that this suggests for the long term. That if the US somehow loses a whole generation of young Chinese that become less interested in traveling to the US or working in the US or studying in the US, then we lose a huge dimension of people-to-people exchange. And that creates not only big challenges for the US, but it creates big challenges for the bilateral relationship overall. Now, we have also looked into how these opinions are extending into attitudes towards business, specifically, Chinese and U.S. businesses, and what we see is similar trends taking place. So actually, when we ask Americans about their perceptions of Chinese companies and Chinese their perceptions about American companies, we actually see similar drops in favorability towards those businesses. As we see towards the countries overall. Some interesting things to note here, though. On the American side, their perceptions of Chinese companies were already fairly negative and have just become much more negative. On the Chinese side, their opinion of US companies, a couple interesting things. One is their opinion of American companies is quite a bit more positive than their opinion of the US overall. And secondly, actually, the change in Chinese opinion towards the U.S. companies is more significant because in fall of last year, a majority of Chinese still said they had a favorable view of American businesses, and this is right in the midst of the trade war period. Now that's flipped, and 2/3 of Chinese say they have a negative view of U.S. companies. So it's a much more negative picture now. And worrying definitely for companies on either side of this. Now, what's impacting people's views about businesses? Similarly, we see COVID-19 coming through quite a bit, especially on the American side. So Americans are saying less about what Chinese companies are actually doing, and more COVID is the number one thing they're saying. Now, there are some other things coming through, questions about trust, about product quality, but it's really COVID. It's a issue that's much bigger than Chinese companies that Americans say are driving their negativity. Similarly, on the Chinese side, you see more government and U.S. national actions impacting how they are thinking about U.S. businesses. So the U.S. government's irresponsible actions and behavior, poor response to the pandemic, support for a boycott China campaign. This is less about the actions of any specific U.S. firms or even U.S. firms in general. It's more about the actions of the government or perceived actions of the government that are then clouding Chinese consumers' opinion of U.S. brands. Now, one very important and interesting nuance in all of this comes from when we ask respondents about trust in businesses. And on the American side, what they tell us is we don't like Chinese companies. We don't trust Chinese companies either. And I think this makes sense because there's a little bit of a cycle in the American information environment where, especially these days, American opinion about China is very much being informed by what they're reading and hearing about Chinese companies. Now it's TikTok, but it was Huawei last year. But similarly, what they're thinking and feeling about Chinese companies is being informed by things that they're reading and hearing about China overall. So, I think that idea that, trust and favorability of Chinese companies and China overall are very much linked on the American side is a very understandable situation. Now, on the Chinese side, it's a very different picture. What the Chinese side says is we don't like brand USA, but we trust those companies to do the right thing. And I think what this comes from is the track record of American companies operating within China. They've had a track record of, delivering high quality products. There haven't been major safety scandals involving U.S. Firms. They've been sort of gold standard operators when it comes to social impact. So it's an interesting situation there. And when we work with a lot of American companies in China, one of our pieces of advice is that those companies really need to be telling their own story and really need to be understood for what they stand for and what they believe in and the positive impact they're making within China. Because it's important for those firms to be seen for what they're doing as a business rather than just be judged from their national origin. And that goes beyond US companies operating in China. I'd argue strongly that Chinese companies operating in the US and globally should be doing the same thing. Now, this is all US-China data, and I actually do want to take a step back and look at some global data around China and how the world sees China. Because it's too easy sometimes to be caught up in this US-China relationship and think that that's everything and how the world thinks about China. It's definitely not true, and we need to have a more nuanced understanding when we look at how the world thinks about China and Chinese companies overall. So we do a annual study looking at how the world sees, China and Chinese businesses. Our most recent wave of this research was conducted last fall, so before the COVID-19 pandemic, and I'll talk a bit about that in a second. And what we found last fall was a very divided picture on how the world sees China and Chinese companies. So this is trust in Chinese companies, but the data around trust in China is just about the same. And what we see is that in developed markets, there was divided picture on trust in China and Chinese companies, and it went down year over year. So it dropped by 5 percentage points. And across most countries surveyed, trust towards China and Chinese companies dropped, including the US. Now, this is the story we hear a lot, and we hear when we're especially reading international media. The story that's not being told is what's going on in the emerging markets. And in the emerging markets, what we found was that trust in China and trust in Chinese companies was not only high, 80% of respondents across emerging markets say they trust Chinese companies and trust China, but it actually went up last year, which was during the trade war situation. So that's the story that's not being told, is that, what is going on in terms of the relationships China's building with the emerging world. What does that mean for the business opportunities for China in those parts of the world? And what does that mean for the future of global power? I think we're headed towards a more divided world. And so I mentioned this research was conducted last fall before the pandemic took place. And I think everything that we're seeing suggests that this gap is growing even wider. That actually emerging markets are either just as trusting or even more trusting, and developed markets have become much less trusting. So we know half of that story right now, in that the Pew Research Center just published 3 days ago new polling on how a group of 14 developed countries look at China. And what their research finds that across those developed markets, negativity has grown, and in most of these places, negativity has reached a highest point since Pew has started polling on this topic for 10 years back. So we know half of that story. We know that the developed markets have become more negative towards China. What we don't know, but we'll answer when we do our next wave of this research, is what's going on in the emerging markets. And my sense is, if you look at how China has engaged with emerging markets throughout the pandemic, is that trust is still strong in those countries. So you look at how China has been providing assistance. First, it was PPE and ventilators and other sort of direct assistance related to COVID to more than 80 countries, most of those being Belt and Road and emerging countries. Now it's transitioned into a more vaccine diplomacy mode, making deals with emerging markets around vaccines and providing loans for that. So, and even when I talk to colleagues we have all over the world, Brazil, South Africa, and ask them, are you seeing sort of growing anti-China sentiment in your countries? The answer is generally no. So, I do think that we're seeing this widening gap globally as a result of the pandemic, not just between the US and China. Now, if we go back to our research, a lot of this gap is coming from how developed and emerging markets see and feel about China's role in the world right now. We asked about favorability towards a wide variety of different political dimensions, ways that China is engaging with the world, from economics and trade to national security, intellectual property, human rights. What you see in developed markets, it's a divided picture when we look at sort of economic, trade, global politics. And then developed markets get much more negative when we're talking about national security, intellectual property, and human rights. When we look at emerging markets and their assessment of China's role in the world, it's much more positive. They have a net positive assessment of China's position across all of those areas. Now, the relative ranking is still the same, where they're still saying I approve more of China's position on economics and trade rather than other issues. But overall, they're giving a positive assessment of the way China's engaging with the world. And we see another dimension in this when we look at the expectations around economic and technological and political power. So we asked in our global survey, which country do you think is the current leader in each of these areas, and who will be the leader by the end of this decade? And if we think about the end of this decade, what's important is that there's agreement across emerging and developed markets. There's a belief that China will become the economic power. It either already is or will become the leading technological power. And at the same time, there's a strong expectation that the US will remain the leading political power. So all of this suggests that the future of world power is very likely to be a multipolar one, with developed markets sort of staying close to the US, but emerging markets pulling closer and closer to China, but even a number of developed markets sort of caught in the middle of feeling that pull of China's economic might, but maybe leaning more towards the US on the political side. So I point all of this out in the context of US-China, just to add another level of understanding of why we should be expecting this tension to be a long-term tension, because it's not just about how the US and China see each other, but it's more about how different parts of the world and different sort of economic tiers are looking at US, China, and all of that's leading or adding evidence to this being a very divided future. I want to close with a couple of final points going back to our US-China survey around attitudes towards investment, cross-border investment. And one trend that we're seeing in the US and China is negativity towards investment between those two countries. In China, there was a strong belief last fall, and it continued into this June, that Chinese companies should be investing less into the US. I wouldn't be surprised if now that sentiment has grown even further. On the American side, their attitudes of wanting to see less US investment into China actually grew. And this is important because this is suggesting that American consumers might have more doubt about the case for being invested into China, not from a business or profit case, but more what that means to have American companies invested into China for this national sentiment that seems to be broadly shared at this moment of wanting to be tougher on China. And that also might create growing expectations for American companies that are operating within China. So we've been tracking this question around whether Americans believe that creating growth and sales for American companies in China is important, even if that means sort of remaining quiet on some political issues, or do Americans believe that American companies should be standing up for American values in China, even if that means sacrificing growth and sales in that market? And 82% of Americans say that they believe that American companies should be standing up for American values. So they aren't believing in this business argument that sometimes you need to adopt different rules, different norms, different laws around the world in order to grow and succeed there. Americans are increasingly becoming resistant to that idea, and that feeds into just a broader idea that Americans have, is that they want to see their companies operating in a consistent way with a consistent set of values anywhere they operate in the world. So we will get into Q&A. I'll just wrap this up by saying that obviously it's a challenging time in the bilateral relationship. I think many people are looking towards the election, at least with the sort of wait and see attitude. Let's see if these things get better. Let's see if the outcome of the election changes things. I think in the short term, the election will likely get us a little bit more breathing room to hopefully restart conversations, diplomatic conversations between the U.S. and China. However, I really do believe we need to be planning for a long-term period of tension between the U.S. and China. And for any organizations that need to operate in both of those countries, we should really be planning what that means and thinking through, what those challenges might be and how best to be navigating those. So thank you all very much. I'm going to turn it over to Eric to lead us through some Q&A.
Thank you, Peter, for sharing with us some of the findings of your latest research on the perception of both sides of the Pacific towards the other side. Please, for our audience, if you would like to submit a question, please submit it through the Q&A button. And I see we have a couple of questions already. Some of them are related to the methodology of your survey, Peter. If you could share with us a little bit more about your methodology in terms of the sample size, the questions type, closed versus open, and so forth. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so for the U.S.-China research, it's an online survey, 1,000 Americans, 1,000 Chinese each time, completely nationally representative, which means that we're setting quotas in place for things like age, region, gender, ethnicity in the U.S., socioeconomic status. So, all of this is designed to really be a cross-section of how either country thinks about the other. Now, it is important on the U.S. side, that is a really truly representative sample. On the Chinese side, I would say it's representative of the online population in China. It's very tough to reach a sort of rural areas without doing sort of face-to-face research. And also there's been a lot of research done that there's still not a lot of difference anymore between the online and sort of offline populations because of the prevalence of cell phone. A lot of people are taking their surveys on cell phones. So that's the sort of research methodology overall. Most questions in the survey are closed-ended, very much structured in a way where it's building. So we're capturing sort of people's very general sentiments first. How do you feel about China, US first, before we're introducing any other information, asking about more targeted issues, all of that allowing us to, get a very clean read on some of the bigger picture issues before we're getting into more sort of focused topics like introducing sort of COVID, and people are linking that to the other country. We do put some open-ended questions. I showed you a couple of those around how people's views are changing about the other country or companies from the other country. But generally closed-ended for a survey research like this.
Thank you, Peter. I have a question myself. So certainly the negative impact of COVID-19 on the perception of Americans and Chinese towards each other, it's not a surprise. What is somewhat surprising and very concerning is in China, the favorable perception towards the U.S. dropped the most among the youngest group of 18 to 29, as you highlighted in your presentation. One would assume that growing up in a digital world, young people in China might have more in common with their peers in the U.S. I was wondering what might be possible drivers for such significant changes among young people in China in their perception of the US?
Sure, sure. Yeah, so I'm one of the things I really enjoy about doing research in China is getting to focus groups on a regular basis too, where we get to, get a bunch of respondents in a room and we have a moderator and ask them a lot of questions in Chinese, obviously, about how they're feeling about different issues. And I always try to sneak in a few questions, even if it's not about U.S. China, sneak in a few questions about how people feel about the U.S. or how they feel about the sort of current political climate we're in now. And one thing that we've noticed over the last few years is that it has been sort of younger people in those groups that have tended to be I think maybe one way to describe it is, maybe sort of nationalistic or just very proud of China and sort of, very, very proud in China's rise and where China is in the world. That although, that is something that I think shared across age groups within China, it is the younger age groups that, we've tended to notice that in a sort of more significant way. And we've done some analysis around the sort of social media environment within China, and our read is that it's probably actually linked to that social media environment and the way that the news on social media, the way that the news on social media and sort of conversation on social media does tend to be a little sharp when it comes to nationalistic sentiment. That is where you'll read sort of more sharp criticisms of the U.S. Even when during this period, if you look at the national media in China, it's been very measured in terms of its tone about the U.S. It's been trying to keep a very sort of I would say, calling the U.S. out on some issues, but doing so in a very sort of neutral tone. It hasn't been trying to stir up tensions against the U.S. as what you saw a few years ago against Japan. So, I think the state media has been taking a very sort of neutral tone, trying to not stir up anti-U.S. sentiment. If you look at the social media conversation, it's very different. You see a lot of that more nationalistic sentiment coming out on a more regular basis. And even how some of the media outlets, even state media outlets, the headline that they'll use on their digital channel is more sort of a little bit more fiery, a little bit more sort of clickbait, trying to get people to a read rather than what's going on in the paper. So I think there's one dimension of that is the information environment overall. I think another dimension of it is just, I think younger people are seeing the U.S. in a very different light, and it's changing very quickly. Is that these are people that maybe wanted to study in the U.S. or did study in the U.S., wanted to work in the U.S., that seeing that climate change in a very negative direction very quickly. And even, talking to colleagues of mine with children that are, planning on filing admissions to a college. What I'm hearing anecdotally is just that interest of studying in the U.S. is becoming less and less because it is a much more, confrontational environment towards, students, Chinese overseas employees in the U.S. So I think there's a variety of different factors going on. But I really do think that information environment and digital media is a huge driver of that.
Speaking of media, we do have a question from our audience about the media coverage of all the politicians in the U.S., China bashing, engaging in China bashing in this election season. Do you think that kind of coverage contributed significantly to the negative perceptions in China towards the U.S.?
Negative perceptions in China towards the U.S. I mean, I think it at the time that we did this research, I would say a little bit. And what I mean by that is that this was before we saw the sort of anti-China sentiment definitely coming out of the administration really step up. So, this was before Secretary of State Pompeo made that, very sort of sharply pointed speech at the Nixon Library, really challenging China on a variety of different fronts. I think it was before you had seen China become a more mainstream election issue. Definitely you're seeing more commentary about that in the presidential debates and even the vice presidential debate yesterday. So, I think that I think it definitely is a factor. We see that in the research about that blame China sentiment being one of those drivers of negativity on the Chinese side, of seeing what the U.S. politicians and as getting picked up by the U.S. media are trying to sort of shift blame for the pandemic to China. So yes, I do think it was a factor at the time of doing the survey. I think it's become even more of a factor now, just because that anti-China sentiment, it does seem to be, it has gotten a lot more fiery and more anti-China over the past several months.
Good. Another question about the perception of China in terms of its leading position in technology by 2030. Based on your survey, even among developing nations, they believe that China will be the leader in the tech sector. Did you find it surprising to have that finding? I certainly understand developing and developed countries, they may have different perceptions, but in terms of technology by 2030, it seems that both developing and developed world countries believe that China will be in that leading position in technology.
Yep. I mean, I don't think that in itself surprised me necessarily. I think what was surprising for me was seeing that emerging countries already believe China to be in that leading position, and developed markets think it's a toss-up between the U.S. and China. So what was surprising to me was more this belief that in both markets that China's already sort of tied or passed the U.S. And I mean, what was a very surprising data point was when we asked Americans that same question. Americans, actually, a majority of Americans believe that China is currently the #1 tech power, but they believe the U.S. will take the lead back at the end of this decade. So, I mean, very interesting view there, where the Americans even had some questions about their own technological position, but optimism that they would, somehow bounce back. So, I think it's definitely interesting data. The one thing that was very interesting for me was how strongly people's views were that the U.S. would remain the global political power, even in emerging markets that are seeing China, really, already in a leading position, have a favorable view of how China is engaging with the world. Still, their belief that the U.S. would remain the leading political power remained extremely strong. I mean, it's not even just sort of close. It was a very strong margin. I think it raises questions about whether people are basing that opinion in sort of fact, or whether it's because sort of having the U.S. as the leading political power is the only thing they can think of over their lifetimes, or over, at least the, sort of 40 years. So, it calls into an interesting question about, whether that's based on sort of a reading of the actual facts, or it's just sort of expectation because they've always known that world order.
Well, we certainly have representatives from the business community today, and one question is about the possible implications of this study on future cross-border economic and investment between the U.S. and China.
Well, yeah. I mean, I think we're seeing it play out in real time in terms of the sort of China outbound to the U.S. I mean, things went from already being extremely difficult. If we look at over the last couple of years, how CFIUS has been really scrutinizing and blocking and challenging investment from China. I mean, it's led to, I remember there was a stat that I think it was last year was, the lowest level of Chinese investment into the U.S. since something like 2000. I mean, it's just this huge drop off. And if we think back to, 2016, 2015, 2016, there was massive amount of Chinese investment going into the U.S. And now we're sort of set back 20 years on that front. And it looks like a very challenging environment going that way, especially if it's anything in the technology field, software, tech platforms, even hardware. I mean, all of that, we're seeing the U.S. government, increasingly, put Chinese companies onto the U.S. entity list, making it very difficult for them to operate in the U.S. Now, on the U.S. into China side, I mean, this is a very different situation. And, I think what we've seen on the China side is that the Chinese government has been trying to signal through all this period that it's still open for business, that it still wants American investment coming in. It wants American companies to stay here. It's never signaled sort of anything other than that. There's been this sort of unreliable entity list that has been more talk than action. But the Chinese government has been trying to, I think, really signal that they still want American investment coming in here. I think what it signals is a couple of things. One is that Chinese investment into the U.S. it's going to be very challenging, and maybe under a different presidential administration, the context could be different. I still think anything related to tech is going to be pretty much impossible. I think for American companies going into China, what we're going to increasingly see is the sort of ring fencing of their operations within China for the China market. I mean, it's important to keep in mind is that most American investment coming into China is for the Chinese market. Manufacturing that American companies are doing within China is mostly for the Chinese market. If you're a pharmaceutical company that has manufacturing within China, those drugs are going to China largely. So what you're going to see is, I think, an increasing trend of American companies creating sort of its own China business for the China market, maybe for APAC region, but really sort of a sort of carved out situation, because it's really it's really a it's just going to be necessity in order to especially make sure that those investments don't become scrutinized on the sort of U.S. side.
Thank you. Next question is, certainly we have the current administration in the U.S. And all during the election season, all the political debates between the two parties, and how did those situations contribute to the current declining opinion of the U.S., particularly under the current political leadership in the U.S. in Washington?
Well, I think I think it's a factor, and I think especially the way that decision making intersects with the pandemic. I think that's where we're seeing it impact views on the Chinese side. We definitely saw that in our research of this poor response to the pandemic being one of those top three factors as to why Chinese say they're becoming more negative towards the U.S. And one thing there is that I think that idea extends beyond the pandemic itself. Is that I think seeing the challenges the U.S. has had getting the pandemic under control, and maybe seeing other things go on domestically, I think it speaks to a bigger idea of just a loss of respect or a loss of standing of the U.S. in the eyes of some Chinese. It used to be this desirable place to want to study or to work or maybe even move to, and now it's become such a confrontational place vis-a-vis China, vis-a-vis Chinese students and Chinese overseas workers. It's become a more difficult environment due to the pandemic, and there's other sort of broader, domestic politics, domestic issues at play that I just think is leading to a sort of reevaluation of the desirability or reputation of the U.S. on the Chinese side. So, I think that's the biggest challenge. It's just these sort of very rapid erosion of Chinese favorability. And we even see that in the tracking data, is that, if we think about how the US, if we look at the data from how the US has looked at China since 1979, there's been a lot of ups and downs there. There's been periods where American perceptions have been much more favorable. There have been periods where it's been much less favorable. So there's been a lot of ups and downs there. On the Chinese side, what we've seen from the data is that, at least since the early 2000s, perceptions of the US has been very positive, very, very positive. And it wasn't until 2019 that things started to really change and drop off. And then this year, it's been a whole new level of, it went from, 3 years ago of a majority of Chinese saying they have a favorable view of the US to now only a quarter. And it's very rare that you see opinion change that quickly about anything. So, I think it is, it's feeding into something that started during the trade war of a more confrontational China policy. And this year is really sort of playing out in a wide variety of different dimensions. Some of those bilateral, some of those domestic political issues within the US. But I think all of it's creating a perfect storm that's leading to more negativity on the Chinese side.
Next question, does your research lend any insight into what might reverse the negative trend of perception?
Well, I mean, it's going to be a long road back up. I mean, that's the challenge, is that, once you get to one of these low points, rebuilding favorability is extremely challenging. And I think that's on both sides. So, both sides have this very negative view of the other. They're increasingly seeing the other country as problems that are sort of getting in the way of their own national interests. And that's just going to take a long road to get out of. So I think there's multiple things that can feed into that. I think continued people-to-people exchange is a very important dimension of that. And I wouldn't be surprised if that's another thing that has been impacted during this COVID period. I mean, we have less travel of people between the US and China, which, is a very important factor of this. Having Chinese students, that environment in the US become as difficult as it is now is not good to people for people-to-people exchange. Having this belief that cross-border investment is a bad thing for both countries is not good for people-to-people exchange, because business is a important carrier of people and sort of enables people-to-people exchange. So I think that's one dimension, is how do we rebuild that interest of people-to-people exchange between these two countries. So that's sort of starting small. Number two is, how do we make sure that the business interests stay there, that there still is business connectivity? Because, what we've seen globally is that, regardless of how you feel about how globalization has impacted the world, you can look at a lot of different indicators that show definitely globalization and shared global economic interests have made the world a safer place in terms of avoiding conflict between countries. So making sure that we're not completely decoupling each other and keeping business interests there is another very important dimension. And then third, it just comes politically too. I think people in either country take so many of their signals from their national leadership and from what the political climate says. And if the political climate is one of negativity, people are going to take their cues there. But if it is one of constructive dialogue, I don't even think we should be thinking about cooperation at this point. I think we're a ways away from that, but at least constructive dialogue, that can start to set a different tone for people in either country. So, I think that, in a lot of ways, the research isn't going to give us the answers, because the research is showing us signals from where a lot of the problems are coming from, and ultimately the solutions are going to have to come from those areas. Political, business, people to people, I think, are all very important dimensions in order to really reverse this tide and get the U.S.-China relationship headed in a better direction. I mean, it's just the thing that concerns me the most in this data is the trend of all of this, is that we're headed more and more in a negative direction, one away from being able to collaborate on key issues. And going to a more confrontational position. And that's the most concerning one that we really do need to figure out how to turn that around, because seeing that continue to slide is not good for either of these countries.
Thank you. A follow-up question about the commercial relationship between the two countries. Certainly, it is a very difficult environment for U.S. companies operating in China, and it's also very challenging for Chinese companies thinking about investing in the U.S. One question from the audience is, are there any practical recommendations, advice from you as to what to do at this in the current environment for both sides, for U.S. companies operating in China as well as for Chinese companies trying to go to the U.S.?
Well, yeah, I think one of the most important things for businesses on either side of this to be doing is making sure that they're really explaining their business intentions, their ambitions, what they're doing in that country to create a positive impact for that country. And just making sure that they're transparent, that they're engaging with government, they're engaging with business partners, they're engaging with the community overall. Because I think that so many of the challenges that we're seeing are bred by distrust and misunderstanding, rather than a real nuanced understanding of what that company's all about. I mean, if you think about Chinese companies in the US, there are notable examples of companies that are operating there very successfully, even in the tech field. And there's companies that have not done it successfully. And I think the biggest difference is this sort of, trust. Does the US government, do US consumers, do US enterprise customers have trust in those businesses? And, trust comes from transparency. It comes from understanding that I feel like I know what that company is all about, that I feel like they're a good actor, that they're going to do the right thing. And I think that extends to American companies within China also, is that, the operating environment right now is a challenging one, definitely. But what an American company doesn't want is to just be seen as sort of a generic American company, because then that exposes you to the risk of dropping negativity towards those brands, increased positivity of boycott. What we've seen is that there have been American companies that have been hurt by this in sectors where there's sort of a viable alternative. So if there's a sort of viable Chinese or another corporate sort of product of sort of similar product quality, similar price point, maybe the American brand is becoming less desirable. Where companies have become less impacted by this is where they have a desirable brand in their own right, where people want to seek that company out because they like that company's products, they believe that the quality is really high, that it's got a desirable brand, and all of that comes from how that company is sort of marketing and communicating and engaging. It's breaking free from just being known as a brand USA company, to actually being seen as, standing for something on their own. So, I think it's important to keep that in mind, to insulate from the politics that are going on and really to be seen for what you are doing on your own, and making sure, importantly, that your key stakeholders, customers, business partners, government, employees all understand that.
Great. Before we close the program today, Peter, would you like to share with us your final remarks, if any?
Yeah, I think just a couple of final statements. One is that it's, what the research shows is it's a very tense point between US China. I think it's gotten even worse. I really appreciate the question that was asked about where do we go from here? And I think that's the really important thing for organizations like C100 and businesses that are touching US China and people involved in the policy sphere to really be thinking about, how do we go from here? Because staying on the trend that we're on right now is not a good one. It's not leading either of these two countries to a good place. Being locked in a more confrontational position, increases the likelihood of misstep that could lead to some sort of conflict. None of us want that. So how do we de-escalate, and how do we get back to a position of dialogue and constructive interaction. And it's a difficult question to ask, but I think it's a very important one for all of us to be thinking about, because this trend is one that isn't going to change on its own, and it needs to be really changed by leadership from different organizations, businesses, and government.
Great. On behalf of the Committee of 100, I'd like to thank Peter Zisk and Brunswick Group for sharing with us their latest research on the perception of Americans and Chinese towards the other country and some possible implications. I would also like to thank the audience for your participation in today's event. We certainly look forward to seeing you in our future events of C100.